I've got a confession to make. I used to be a girl guide, believe it or not, and I know what you're thinking. I don't really have the girl guide look, but really it's just this club that you join as a kid and you have to say these like weird little mottos and promises, and you meet up in your local town hall after school. You might go camping from time to time too. You might do a play. It's all very fun. So I guess being part of these clubs as a kid gave me a little taster on what it must be like to be part of the Bohemian Grove. Except swap the town hall for a 2,700-acre campground in Monterey, California, and swap a bunch of annoying neighborhood kids for some of the most powerful men in the entire world. That's right. Today we are talking about the 2-week-long retreat of the Bohemian Club, a place where weaving spiders, women and outsiders are supposedly banned. A place whose mythology and conspiracy is far-reaching thanks to a controversial Austin-based doommonger. But what really goes on behind the shroud of secrecy? Sinister conspiracy, or just capitalism and cronyism trickling down through the green needle leaves of the redwood forest? Before we get into it, if you haven't yet subscribed, then why the hell not? I make videos on all things weird, pop culture, crimes, cults, conspiracies. We do deep dives and weird vibes. And if I sound like I'm talking in pig Latin during this video, that's just a way to bypass the evil hand of YouTube demonetization. Thank you very much, Susan. Without further ado, grab yourself a drink, or in my case, a friendly, one-eared version of the owl god Moloch, and let's dive into everything you never knew about Bohemian Grove.
What are a group of some of the most powerful men in the country meeting in the forests of California?
Did you say the Bohemian Club? That's where all those rich Republicans go up and stand naked against redwood trees.
The exclusive all-male Bohemian Club.
Millionaires, billionaires.
The real decisions that get made in this country are not necessarily in Congress. They are usually behind closed doors.
There you see the funeral pyre burning with the effigy of a human.
Like a boys' camp, the Grove has a symbol. In this case, a somewhat fierce-looking owl.
Dressing up like druids and worshiping the owl god Moloch. That's real, dude.
Mainstream media didn't become aware of me until 2002.
Keep walking. There's cameras in the trees. There's owls everywhere.
When I conducted a raid on the Bohemian Grove as the Phantom Patriot.
The Bohemian Grove is only an instance, only one piece of what we call the power structure.
I saw Faustian rituals of old men doing deep breathing in circles going.
Before we take a trip out to the redwood forests of California, we need to go back to San Francisco in 1872 and the founding of the Bohemian Club. Originally, the Bohemian Club was started by newspaper journalists, and according to accounts that I read, they considered themselves to be the intellectual elite of San Francisco. The Bohemian Club was basically a way to separate themselves from other elite social clubs for men that were around at the time. Did I mention it's men only? There's no pesky women allowed. They used to meet at the home of their co-founder James F. Bowman, who served as the club's secretary for the first 2 years of its creation. The founding spirit of the Bohemian Club was relatively harmless, with breakfast meetings every Sunday at Bowman's home. The meetings would go on through the day and all of the Bohemian Club members would get drunk and let loose. And it wasn't before long that the club grew significantly in membership and soon outgrew Bowman's home. Nathaniel Britton, another co-founder of the Bohemian Club, actually built a house known as the Nathaniel Britton Party House to entertain his friends from the club and to also use it as a kind of
hunting lodge for rich weirdos.
There are reports that the founding members of the Bohemian Club wanted to have rich businessmen join because people without money would not be able to support the club and therefore it wouldn't grow. The founding statement of the club said that it was for the promotion of social and intellectual intercourse between journalists and other writers, artists, actors and musicians, professional or amateur, and such others not included in this list as may, by reason of knowledge and appreciation of polite literature and the fine arts, be deemed worthy of membership. It basically became a club that some of the richest blokes in San Francisco joined, and it was listed in the elite directory, the San Francisco Blue Book, and another social book called Our Society Blue Book. They relocated to the back room of a property that was owned by another local fraternity club thing called Jolly Corks, and it was here that the rules of the club became drafted. Basically, you can join the club as long as you can afford it and as long as you're not a woman. The club's motto is "Weaving Spiders Come Not Here," which is taken from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it basically means no talking shop. Don't go spinning no webs at the Bohemian Club, except many webs have been spun at the Bohemian Club. Some of the early members included Ambrose Bierce, who wrote the book The Devil's Dictionary, the poet Charles Warren Stoddard, among others. The club also had honorary members such as Mark Twain and Bret Hart, and everyone's favourite racist coloniser Rudyard Kipling stopped by. Once the Bohemian Club had gotten settled at the back room at Jolly Corks, they began to put on what they called jinks. These were performances, and they were named after hijinks, which is defined as boisterous or rambunctious carryings on. Having a laugh, basically, and we'll go more into hijinks and low jinks later on. Oscar Wilde also remarked that he had never seen so many well-dressed, well-fed, business-like bohemians in his entire life when he took a trip to San Francisco in the late 1800s.
Girl, the shade of it all.
So it's basically this group of rich yuppies in San Fran trying to feel intellectually superior to everyone else while also sucking up to the rich lads. I don't know about you, but I am very glad that times have changed. The club acquired property at 624 Taylor Street in San Francisco, and before you think I'm doxing them, that address is extremely public. You can find it on Google. It's quite an opulent building. On the main floor, there's a reading room that has been described as church-like, as well as a dominoes room, which I'm assuming is now probably a general games room, although dominoes is still popular somehow. But the most popular room in the building is probably the cartoon room, which features paintings and posters from some of the club's most famous honorary members. It's also got a bar. Who doesn't love a bar? The Bohemians bloody love a bar. But how does one join such an esteemed club like the Bohemians? Well, it's invite only, and each potential member has to be recommended by 2 existing members who will vouch for them and their character. The Bohemians also circulate names of potential members within their ranks and essentially get the group's opinion on who should join. There are 15 directors that sit on the board, but most of the day-to-day work of running the club is delegated to their many subcommittees, because who doesn't love bureaucracy in your nefarious and highly secretive secret society? There's a Jinx committee that looks after all of the shows and plays. There's a Grove committee that looks after... We're going to get there. We will get there, I promise. They even have a wine committee where they just sit around drinking wine. It really does sound like a hard life to be a Bohemian, doesn't it? The Bohemians also adopted the owl. You have to forgive my one-eared owl. I've had this for years, but I thought it was relevant to the video. They basically adopted the owl as their symbol because it supposedly represents wisdom, and it goes back to Greek mythology, with the owl representing the goddess Athena, who herself was supposedly the goddess of wisdom. And the owl is thought of as being like dead smart, basically. So it isn't entirely surprising why they chose the owl, not this specific owl, but just the owl in general, as a kind of mascot. The club began going on trips in the late 1870s, and there are conflicting accounts, but from what I've seen, the first get-together outside of the main meeting place of the club was on June 29th, 1878, when they threw a going-away party for one of their members, Henry Edwards. They had such a bloody good time that they decided to do it again the next year, and it became known as their Midsummer Hijinks, which is definitely giving Florence Pugh, Mayflower, Burning Bear energy. Then they decided to venture out to Santa Rosa County in an area that was formerly known as Meeker's Grove, which was then owned by a man named Melvin Cyrus Meeker, who was a logger. They rented the property from him in 1893 until they finally bought it off him in 1899, thus turning Meeker's Grove into the infamous Bohemian Grove.
The media aren't allowed in. In fact, the Bohemians have a long history of secrecy. The protesters say the Bohemians are drunk with power.
At the time of purchase, Bohemian Grove was only 160 acres of property, but the Bohemian Club added to this over the years and decades, eventually growing to 2,700 acres, enough space for the Bohemians to have their privacy. The honorary members list begins to grow and even includes people like William Randolph Hearst, despite the Bohemian Club stating that they would not allow newspaper publishers to join the gang. In the beginning, most of the Bohemians were sleeping in tents, but they had set up a bar, a write-in tent, and a bathhouse as well for them to enjoy. However, times have definitely changed, and nowadays Bohemian Grove is vast and well organised. Few have been inside, but there are maps of the general layout of the Grove from years ago that give a general idea of the setup.
Bohemian Grove is actually divided into about 120 different camps. It's like you took the fraternity row at a big university and moved it up into the redwoods. Each of these camps has a little pet name like Aviary, or Sons of Toil, or Druids, or Mandalay, or Wolf. And each of these camps also has a special drink that it offers. It has special gags that it plays upon the visitors who come to see them. The men are constantly moving around from camp to camp, talking to each other. The mythology is that all of these camps are equal, but the truth is that some of these camps are a lot more equal than others.
Currently, there are over 100 different campsites. I think most of them are no longer camping and are more like cabins, but who knows? We aren't allowed inside. The camps all have different names, with one of the most infamous being Hillbillies, which is known to have housed George H.W. Bush, William Draper, and Alden Clausen, your typical three Bohemian stooges. Then there's Owl's Nest, where Ronald Reagan is alleged to have stayed when he visited the Grove. Each camp is assigned with a captain who is responsible for the general maintenance and upkeep of their camp.
Summer camp at the Bohemian Grove always takes place in the last 2 weeks in July, when the weather is usually perfect. The encampment encompasses 3 weekends, and it's on the weekends that there's 1,500 to 2,000 men in the Grove. During the rest of the week, attendance can dip as low as 350 to 400.
Outside of the camps are where the real action happens, and yes, we are going to get onto the Owl. There's a huge focus on arts and entertainment at the Grove, so much so that they have their own 2,000-seater amphitheatre which contains the largest outdoor pipe organ in the world, and this is where the Grove Play is performed on the final weekend of the retreat. The Grove Play is a super grand affair, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce each year. It's what they call the hijinks, and it can easily amass over 100 people to perform in it. Then there's the Field Circle, which is another amphitheatre that the Bohemians use for other performances, along with the Campfire Circle and the Museum Stage. This is generally where what they call low jinks takes place. If the high jinks are a Broadway show, the low jinks is off Broadway. Decidedly more lowbrow. Think Punch and Judy versus Hamlet. It's slapstick. Often the Bohemians dress in drag, and it's rowdy. Definitely costs a lot less than the grander hijinks performances. For food, there's the dining circle where, clues in the name, the Bohemians go to eat on these long tables that are kind of placed in a circle. Then there's the clubhouse, which was designed by Bernard Maybeck, and it has this kind of Twin Peaks vibe to it. It's giving the Great Northern. This is where Ben Horne hangs out and does all of his shady web weaving.
And little lambs eat ivy.
It's also known as the Chalet, and interestingly, in 1942, it was the setting for a planning meeting that essentially birthed the Manhattan Project. So weaving spiders aren't allowed at the Grove, but planning the creation of atomic bombs is absolutely fine. And last but not least, what most of you are here to see, we have the Owl Shrine and the artificial lake. Arguably, this is the most infamous part of Bohemian Grove, despite the clubhouse most likely being the setting for the more shady meetings that happen there. So it's essentially a man-made lake, and the Bohemians are on one side of it, and on the other side there's a makeshift stage that has stone steps, and at the top of the steps is a 30-foot hollow owl statue made from concrete. Much has been said about the damn owl, and we will get onto that in a minute, but for me, the biggest red flag of Bohemian Grove is the lakeside talks.
There's not much business going on up there. There is a lot of politicking going on, and that politicking takes place primarily around what are called the lakeside talks, where the speaker stands on a podium that looks with his back to the lake, looking out towards the men that are sitting on the bank.
This is where notable Bohemian Club members give speeches on all sorts of topics, but some of the common themes are government, war, and the economy.
During the week, the talk might be by an artist, it might be by a professor, it might be by a business person. The talks vary a great deal in their substance. One year, they had an astronaut speak, for example, and telling how it was to be way up there. But on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the talks get heavier. They're more likely, much more likely, to be about politics, and they'll involve some of the most important people in the world giving the talk.
Some of the most notable Bohemians to give speeches include George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and notable war criminal Henry Kissinger, who gave a long speech where he essentially lobbied his foreign policy ideas. For a group whose motto basically says no business at the Grove, there's a hell of a lot of business going on at the Grove. For example, while staying at the Hillbillies camp, George H.W. Bush was bunking with a bunch of powerful executives from corporations like Bank of America and Procter & Gamble. Ronald Reagan was staying at Owl's Nest with executives from United Airlines and other big companies in the 1970s. And while none of us really know what went on or what the Bohemians discussed outside of some of the lakeside talks that have been leaked, is the secrecy that gives way to conspiracy. Richard Nixon himself said that if I were to choose the speech that gave me the most pleasure and satisfaction in my political career, it would be my lakeside speech at the Bohemian Grove in July 1967. Because this speech traditionally was off the record, it received no publicity at the time. But in many important ways, it marked the first milestone on my road to the presidency. Nixon also noted that he had a private and candid discussion with Ronald Reagan at the Grove and told him of his plan to enter the primaries to become the Republican presidential candidate. And in the words of William Donhoff, they came to a deal at the Grove, with Reagan saying that he would only enter the primaries if Nixon faltered. But instead of focusing on these lakeside talks or the policy making that's clearly going on behind the scenes, when you mention Bohemian Grove, most people are only going to want to talk about one thing: the opening performance, where according to some, a sacrifice is made to a sneaky owl god named Moloch.
Did you ever see that Bohemian Grove thing? That is absolutely 100% real. No, it's not so what, Brian? It's people dressing up like wizards, saying some sacred ritual.
Doesn't mean they control shit.
It's weird, burning an effigy in front of an owl god.
Same with Burning Man.
The lake and the owl are all part of the infamous Cremation of Care ceremony, which has riled up conspiracy theories all over the world with allegations of child sacrifice and devil worship. But what is this ceremony and why is it so controversial? The simplest explanation for the Cremation of Care ceremony is that the Bohemians are quite literally cremating their cares at the beginning of each retreat. The effigy of Care, also called Dull Care, is set on fire by a bunch of dudes in hooded robes and fancy costumes. Hence why I decided to wear the hood today. When they burn the effigy of Care, it's symbolic. It's all of the worries and anxieties from the world outside, and they don't exist in the Grove for 2 weeks. They're just burning them away.
It takes a cast of over 250 elders, priests, torchbearers, fire tenders, and woodland voices to conduct the ceremony.
The problem is it all looks a bit weird. It's got this 1970s schlocky hammer horror energy to it, and I'm expecting Sergeant Howie to show up any minute.
I suspect murder and conspiracy too.
It's also been voiced by Walter Cronkite.
Old anchormen, you see, don't fade away. They just keep coming back for more.
Whose voice belongs to the Christopher Lee and Vincent Price genre of booming and quite terrifying male voices. From the outside, it looks like the fever dream of Jake Angeli and the rest of the followers of the 17th letter of the alphabet. But the important thing to remember about the Bohemians is that they're a theatrical bunch, and this ceremony isn't really intended to be serious.
It's like they're back in college and there's a big fraternity bonfire.
So here's what actually happens. The Bohemians are sitting around having a nice fancy dinner, they're all catching up, they're doing that kind of thing. Then suddenly you start to hear music playing and these hooded dudes show up with an open coffin, and inside is Dull Care, or the effigy of Dull Care, which is the physical representation of all of the outside worries and hardships that these men have to carry with them in the outside world. Being a powerful and affluent man is really tough, you guys. The Bohemians wrap up their dinner and follow the hooded dudes and Care, and it becomes a procession that leads to the lake, where they put Care on a boat and they guide him towards an altar that is set up in front of the owl.
First, a tree spirit comes out of a big redwood and sings about the beauty of the setting.
There's a guy in leaf-covered lederhosen appears in like a stage cut out of the redwood tree and starts singing this kind of elegy to nature, like, oh trees, oh leaves.
After that, it's the high priest that comes in and talks about the owl being in his leafy temple.
The owl is in his leafy temple. Let all within the grove be reverent before him.
And that this is Bohemia's shrine, and then he repeats the club's motto. Then it's more nature fanboy stuff, which really is surprising for a group that have been engaged in illegal logging activities. Then they get on to burning Care, which I really have to clarify is not a human being, but is a bundle of sticks that represents anxieties and worries and cares in the outside world.
Fire shall have a swirl of thee, and all the winds make merry with thy dust.
But Care does not want to be burned, and he basically just goes off.
When will ye learn that me ye cannot slay? Fools to dream ye conquer care.
This is the bit that irks me the most about the people that try and claim that this is some sort of satanic ritual. Like, they're literally telling you that they're burning away their cares, that caring is a burden that they don't want to carry with them.
When again, ye turn your faces to the marketplace, do ye not find me waiting as a rule?
There's no sacrifice, it's an effigy, and the effigy of care literally starts talking in the middle of the ceremony.
Fools to dream ye conquer care.
The Cremation of Care is basically some of the richest and most influential men in the world celebrating the death of caring.
Begone, dull care. Fire shall have its will of thee.
It's not some nefarious sacrifice to their owl god. It's pageantry to ring in 2 weeks of not giving a shit.
Midsummer sets us free.
Encouraging this boys will be boys frat house attitude, and that should be the alarming thing, that these highly influential men gather in the woods once a year and behave like absolute animals. That, and the fact that we know the entire campground is overrun by weaving spiders and that the Bohemian Club's motto is really just a smokescreen. But what about this Moloch the owl god figure that they're supposedly worshipping?
Dressing up like druids and worshipping the owl god Moloch. That's real, dude.
Well, it turns out that Moloch isn't actually an owl. Moloch is a Canaanite deity associated with child sacrifice in the Bible, and it's actually depicted as a bull, not an owl. There is literally no depiction of Moloch that I could find outside of what we're going to talk about where it's depicted as an owl. Moloch is also supposed to have boiled children alive in the statue of his body, which is made of bronze. It's all very bizarre, but that's not what's happening at the Cremation of Care ceremony or Bohemian Grove. And I know that's going to be controversial for some people because their minds have been so totally warped by that controversial Austin-based doommonger that I mentioned at the beginning. So let's address that elephant in the room.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Turn the friggin' frogs gay. Serious crap.
This is how George Bush dresses up. Right here. We got him on tape. This is how they dress up. Right here. In red and black robes. A little more pointy though, like the Klan.
Sadly, you can't make a video about Bohemian Grove without having to talk about Alex Jones. He's widely thought of as being the only person that's managed to sneak into the Grove, but that's really untrue. The first person to actually sneak in and write about it was Rick Clogger, who wrote the piece Weaving Spiders Come Not Here inside the retreat of the power elite for Mother Jones in August 1981. His piece doesn't really indulge in the satanic panic-esque hysteria of Alex Jones and instead focuses on what these men actually do at Bohemian Grove. Spoiler alert, just because women aren't allowed to join the Bohemian Club doesn't mean that the Grove is devoid of women. And he wrote that the Bohemians were quite well known for hiring local women. I think you're picking up what I'm putting down. Then in 1989, Philip Weiss managed to sneak in and he wrote a piece for Spy magazine called Inside Bohemian Grove. Again, this article doesn't talk about Moloch owl gods or sinister conspiracy theories. It focuses on facts, like the fact that the Bohemians are widely encouraged to drink as much as possible and let loose. And what does letting loose look like? Well, for a lot of them, it looks like being able to urinate wherever you want. Like, I'm being serious. There's even signs on certain trees discouraging members from urinating there because the practice is so prolific, they're literally doing it everywhere. Philip Weiss is also the journalist that confirmed the meeting between Nixon and Reagan in the late 1960s by literally just going up to Ronald Reagan at the Grove and asking him. So how did Alex Jones and his cameraman Mike Hansen get in and film the infamous Cremation of Care? Well, back in the early 2000s, John Ronson was working on a documentary film series called Secret Rulers of the World. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of like Louis Theroux type documentaries. It's good. It's a bit dated, but it's good.
This is the story of one man's attempts to infiltrate and secretly film inside Bohemian Grove.
In it, he follows Alex Jones, who at the time was broadcasting from his bedroom, and he was making a name for himself by helping the Branch Davidians build a new church after the Waco massacre.
Alex is a syndicated talk show host from Austin, Texas. He broadcasts from his bedroom down an ISDN line to 8 million listeners.
This man is only 26 years old. Considering what he has accomplished and demonstrated in building this church, I believe that by age 36, he could become the youngest president of the United States. Is Alex Jones.
The 90s were quite a formative decade for people like Alex Jones, at the time describing himself as just an old school Republican and just a harmless libertarian who felt threatened by big government, which wasn't exactly true considering that he'd been peddling satanic panic flavoured conspiracies for a while. It was a decade that brought Ruby Ridge and Waco, two events that are seared onto the memories of both right-wing militias and people that are concerned about a militarised police force. And of course, Ruby Ridge and Waco fueled extremism as many points of both of those events as being the catalyst for the Oklahoma City bombing. But in Alex Jones's world, Oklahoma City was perpetrated by the government to demonise people like him.
And they can have their big phony celebration and memorial for those that died at Oklahoma City. I'm sad they died. I'm also sad the government destroyed that building and is attempting to blame it on good, decent people like myself.
Paranoid? Sure, but even back then, Alex had a platform of almost 8 million listeners and his influence was only just beginning. He decided that he was going to infiltrate Bohemian Grove and John Ronson came along to document the process in both TV and book format.
I'm willing. I mean, hiking into 2,700 acres is not too hard. We need to get into the woods, we need to insert ourselves, we need to catch these people at their business.
Alex spoke about his encounter at the Grove on a podcast hosted by Andrew Schultz recently, and he said that he was paid by World of Wonder, which was the production team behind the John Ronson docuseries, to sneak in.
I was paid to sneak in by British Broadcasting Group, not BBC, but it was World of Wonder and Channel 4, because they didn't want the liability. They had the passcodes. They actually could help get me in through the Secret Service.
It's not really unusual for documentary subjects to be like paid by production teams, so getting a financial reward isn't very surprising. But he goes on to say that insiders gave him information on how to get into the Grove and that they gave him passcodes that he then gave to security.
So the Secret Service comes up and then later the Sheriff's Department, what's your passcode? What are you doing? I go, I'm with the Lost Boys, because I had the code word to this particular camp. They go, oh, you're from Texas with the Bushes. All right, that's okay. And also, they go, well, what's the other code word? I go, hillbillies, because I was told by insiders how to get in. And I'm not sure why they still did it, why I was given it. People said, hey, Jones was let in. Later, I figured out I was.
Yeah.
So I don't know why I was let in. John Ronson's like, don't ever tell anybody I did this.
Doug.
He literally says that he was let in and that he's not sure why. He says that John Ronson was the one that had all the codes and that a lawyer from Bohemian Grove said that the chalet, aka the clubhouse, had decided that he would be allowed in. Alex Jones then asked the question, why would they let me in? Before Alex Jones, the Bohemian Grove Action Network, which was founded by Mary Moore in 1980, were tirelessly protesting about the Grove.
The real decision making that happens in this country does not happen through our elected representatives. It happens through an established good old boys network, what a lot of us refer to as the ruling class. It happens, the real decisions that get made in this country are not necessarily in Congress. They are usually behind closed doors. Bohemian Grove just happens to be a prime example of one of many places that these men get together without public scrutiny.
Mary Moore is a far cry from someone like Alex Jones. She's an old school hippie, bit of like a California type anti-war activist, and she doesn't peddle in satanic panic. She's a local to the Grove as well. She lives in one of the small towns nearby, and in an interview with Vice magazine she said, "The thing that we should be concerned about is the lakeside talks. They're public policy talks where these powerful people discuss and choose policy, but they do so in secrecy, with no public scrutiny, and that's what people should be afraid of." It's thanks to the Bohemian Grove Action Network that Rick Clogger and Philip Weiss managed to sneak in the first place. The network actually built relationships with employees inside the Grove, and over the years they managed to find all sorts of pieces of information, and they would assist journalists in actually getting inside. They also managed to get quite a lot of positive scrutiny on Bohemian Grove, with multiple news outlets in the 80s covering the retreat. However, in the 90s, when President Bill Clinton came to power, Mary Moore started to scale back her own involvement, saying that, "I'm not a fan of Clinton, but unlike Alex Jones's claims, Clinton's not a member. So when he came to power, the landscape was changing. We were there protesting right through George Bush Sr. And as for the rest of the 90s, I lost interest. I'm 77. I'm tired. Got other things to do."
Did you say the Bohemian Club? Yeah. That's where all those rich Republicans go up and stand naked against redwood trees, right? I've never been to the Bohemian Club, but you ought to go. It'd be good for you. Get some fresh air.
So in the John Ronson show, this lawyer that Alex Jones was referring to is actually in it, and he's called Rick. And John Ronson says that Mary Moore is the one that put him onto Rick in the first place.
This is Rick, the lawyer, who's agreed to tell Alex what he knows about Bohemian Grove. Rick is not a conspiracy theorist. He infiltrated the place simply because he was curious. He'd heard so much local gossip about the Grove. It was my idea to introduce Alex to Rick. It was Mary who told me about him.
Alex is super sceptical when Rick tells him the most effective way to get inside is to don a pair of khakis and stroll in through the front gate.
I would just walk in here. There are going to be one or two guys sitting by the side of this road in a camp chair, looking bored and uninterested, and you're just going to say, just nod to them as you walk in. That's it. I'd walk in wearing this shirt and a pair of khakis, and I just walk in from Monte Rio.
But because it's kind of, preppy clothes.
Yeah, preppy.
Alex Jones is a red-blooded American man. It's blue jeans or nothing at all.
Lord have mercy, baby's got her blue jeans on.
But he does as he's told, and he puts on the khakis.
So there's like this hat, which is one I probably end up wearing.
Looks so handsome.
And then there's this hat.
And he manages to get in. And as far as we can see on the footage, he doesn't actually utter a code to anyone, but that could have easily have been edited out. Another interesting bit of information that's missing from the documentary is that John Ronson actually snuck in too with the lawyer.
Bohemian Grove is a real mindfuck. When you see all these super rich people wearing robes,
well, I was
burning
there.
an effigy, yeah.
I was in the crowd.
And he says on the Joe Rogan show that Alex started to think that he was part of this secret plot to lure him inside of the Grove.
Because Alex got it into his head that maybe I was part of the Bohemian Grove
you're
plot.
like deep inside.
Yeah, like the Wicker Man, that I was like luring him in, and he would be the one sacrificed in the belly of the owl.
Oh, no.
So he went in separately to me. He went in via the undergrowth.
Now, despite being told to just walk inside and act normal, Alex and Mark decided to sneak in through the woods and into the parking lot where they have like a really nice normal discussion with some other guests about the redwood trees before getting on board a shuttle bus called the Owl.
I think there are three kinds of redwoods. There's the Sequoia and the Sierra.
Here comes the thing, Mike.
And there's the coast redwood.
Yeah.
And then there's a Chinese redwood, and there's one or two of the Chinese redwoods somewhere in the grove. Aren't they the biggest? Oh, the owl. They're the biggest living thing, I think, aren't they?
Oh yeah, they're incredibly large.
At no point in this entire encounter do Mark or Alex exchange secret codes with anyone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't allowed in. In the article Weird in the Bohemian Grove, Robert Skvala writes about how before Alex Jones, the discussion around the Grove wasn't about sacrifices and owl gods, it was focused on things like the Lakeside Talks and the ethicalness of having so many powerful men meet in secret. After Alex Jones, the conversation changed. It became about ritual sacrifice and sinister conspiracy, and the accusation that the Cremation of Care was some kind of satanic offering to the cult of Moloch.
And how can you forget this? The image of a human body burning on the altar. Again, this is what they were handing out to those that were witnessing these macabre activities.
Robert writes that by Weird in the Bohemian Grove, Alex Jones destroyed decades of activism, which I think is true because talk to anyone now about Bohemian Grove and the first thing they're most likely mention is mock sacrifice and the dreaded owl god. It's a claim that's been repeated as fact by people like Joe Rogan, who has one of the biggest podcasts in the entire world.
Now, what we're watching for people that are just listening is a bunch of people wearing robes that are burning an effigy in front of a giant statue of Moloch, the owl god.
And it's the effigy of a child.
Well, I don't know if it's what it is.
I think it's the effigy of a child.
It looks like a grown woman to me.
He's real mad right here.
And yeah, okay, watch this.
But just a few minutes of research would destroy the notion of the owl symbol being a reference to Moloch. Is it a bit weird? Sure, it's definitely weird. And like John Ronson says on the Joe Rogan podcast,
there does seem to be amongst the American ruling elites, there does seem to be a proclivity for ritual.
Yeah.
Maybe amongst the British elites as well, I'm not sure. But But that's in itself psychologically interesting.
I think secrets too.
But given what we know about the Grove, I'd argue that it's more on the theatrical side than an actual ritual, which is why it was only really mentioned in passing in any of the articles that were released about the Grove pre-Alex Jones. Which begs us to ask the question, does Bohemian Grove benefit from these hysterical allegations of sacrifice and Satanism? Does it work in their favour, allowing them to lump all those concerned about secrecy in the top levels of power in with people like Alex Jones, a man who seems to have no problem spreading some of the nastiest and most harmful conspiracy theories, and a man that's courted and encouraged extremism in his own right?
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left.
Don't let these cold-blooded reptiles destroy the world.
In his book American Madness, T. Krulos details the story of Richard McCaslin, better known by his alias as the Phantom Patriot. And if you're anything like me and you have like a love or hate relationship with conspiracy theories, then this book is going to be right up your street. It's basically about how people like Alex Jones and others have permeated the American psyche, and how that's led to people like Richard, who is the main focus of the book. But it's not just people like Richard. We see it in like the 17th letter of the alphabet, the pizza thing. All of that kind of stuff is direct response to the stuff that is being peddled by Alex Jones. Richard McCaslin was born on June 20th, 1964 in a place called Zanesville, Ohio. His family were fairly typical, but Richard's dad was definitely abusive and would tell him things like he'd wished he'd never been born. Like a lot of kids, he had a strong interest in comic books and superheroes, and he would even draw his own. Richard also spoke about how his teenage years at high school sucked because he never had a date, and T. Krulos writes that this was a recurring theme in Richard's life. A depressed, lovesick desperation for a relationship that would eventually lead to a disturbing obsession. He joined the Marines in 1982 and he was there for 3 years. Then, in 1985, Richard created his own version of a superhero, calling himself the Lynx, and he also got himself a sidekick called Iron Claw. He then went on to join a stunt school, but afterwards he couldn't really find much stunt work, so he ended up working odd jobs, although he did get a very small role in the movie Brain Donors in 1992. During this time, he's really active in cosplaying, dressing up as superheroes, and he eventually gets a job working on the Batman show at Six Flags in Houston. His parents' health begins to decline and his father dies, and Richard then ends up losing his job on the Batman show. His mum goes into a care facility and Richard moves around a lot looking for work, and he eventually settles in Austin, Texas. It's a very abbreviated history. There is so much more detail in this book, I could not recommend it enough. In this time, he also grew obsessed with the country musician Shelley Wright.
He's a good old boy.
Even going so far as to bid almost $15,000 in a charity auction to have dinner with her. In the book, T writes that the situation with Shelley had hints of incel subculture and that Richard felt entitled to have a relationship with her because he'd paid for a dinner. All of this is happening in the early 2000s, which is around the same time that Alex Jones is gaining publicity and national radio syndication, and around the same time that Alex is releasing his film about Bohemian Grove.
Now, I personally am a Christian, but even an atheist should be concerned about the information we're about to bring forward in this new documentary film, The Dark Secrets Inside Bohemian Grove.
Alex Jones, as well as others, inspired Richard's superhero creation, the Phantom Patriot. All dressed up in a Captain America style boiler suit and a mask remarkably similar to the Misfits cover art, Richard McCaslin became the first person to raid the Bohemian Grove with a Crossfire MK1, a Glock, a ninja sword, and a Kabar knife. He was also carrying over 100 rounds of ammunition.
Mainstream media didn't become aware of me until 2002, when I conducted a raid on the Bohemian Grove as the Phantom Patriot. I found out the hard way that if you use extreme tactics to expose and murderers of the Bohemian Club, like George Bush Sr. and Dick Cheney, you will get locked up.
Thankfully, the Bohemian Grove was empty when Richard decided to break in, and there weren't any offerings to Moloch that he could find. He left a piece of paper on the concrete owl with his Phantom Patriot logo on it and a reference to Leviticus 18:21, which reads, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Moloch, nor should you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. He actually ended up getting lost in the grove overnight, and he actually slept in a cabin. In the morning, he made his way to the banquet hall where he splashed around a bunch of degreaser and set fire to it, but the sprinklers went off and they put it out. He then makes his way out of the grove where he's surrounded by cops, and the police report read that when the subject came into view, I could see he was wearing a blue paramilitary uniform, a belt with what appeared to be a sidearm, and I could see that he was carrying an assault rifle with a high-capacity banana-style magazine. Subject was wearing a full latex mask. The character of the mask was a skeleton skull. In letters that Richard wrote with T. Krulos, he said that he was prepared to die for the cause, but in the moment he wondered what Shelley Wright would think of him. He says that he could have gone out in a blaze of glory, but he kept thinking about her and whether he would see her again. Richard McCaslin was directly influenced by Alex Jones's film on Bohemian Grove, but typically Alex Jones tried to absolve himself of any and all responsibility. People like Alex Jones hide behind the idea of freedom of speech to ensure that they don't have to face the consequences of their actions.
Well, sometimes people claim they've been hurt and they haven't been. So you have to look at the agenda behind things. And I myself have, almost had like a form of psychosis back in the past where I basically thought everything was staged, even though I've now learned a lot of times things aren't staged. So, I think as a pundit and someone giving opinion, that, my opinions have been wrong, but they were never wrong consciously to hurt people.
If it wasn't for Alex Jones and his documentary on the Grove, the pervasive myth of Moloch the owl god in the Redwood Forest wouldn't exist, or at the very least it wouldn't be as prominent as it is today. It's easy for us to look at a video like Dark Secrets and see it as some kind of found footage horror film like the Blair Witch Project instead of what it really is. Shakily filmed misinformation steeped in satanic panic hysteria. Alex Jones didn't uncover anything new at the Grove, he just got it on videotape. And without knowledge of the history of the Bohemian Grove or what the Cremation of Care actually means, it's really easy for people on the outside to see it how Alex wants us to see it, how he wanted Richard to see it.
This hearse comes in with the body of a child. It is an effigy. They're not killing it.
And it's just a bundle of sticks, right?
Yeah, well, it looks like a kid. No, later, others infiltrated later that worked there and got us photos of it. It's an image of a kid. It's a little kid.
Because Moloch in biblical is who they sacrifice to Canaanite.
It's a bull, but they do it as an owl.
But they do it as an owl, yeah. But that's from the Bible, is you would sacrifice a child to Moloch.
Give not your children to the fires of Moloch.
Richard was convicted in April 2002 of arson, burglary and brandishing a weapon at a peace officer, and of 2 enhancements for being armed and wearing a bulletproof vest while committing his crimes. He was released in 2008 and he spent 3 years on parole. But his time inside prison and his time on parole didn't really change any of his beliefs. And he even created a new superhero persona called Thought Crime, and he went on a tour across all of the US states to protest the New World Order, Bohemian Grove, everything. It's all the conspiracies wrapped into one. In the Secret Service report that T. Krulos obtained for his book, they said that Richard had grown up with a physically abusive father and that it wasn't a surprise that Richard had wanted to come to the rescue of children that he believed were under threat. They said that this history made him particularly vulnerable to Alex Jones's theory that Bohemian Grove was a place where children were under threat. This kind of goes back to my previous video on satanic panic and the notion of saving the children. That it's an honourable mission statement that nobody can really argue with. Of course we want to protect children, but people like Alex Jones seem to be using the idea of children being under threat to sell their conspiracies, and their conspiracies make them a lot of money. In the later part of his life, Richard moved to Pahrump, Nevada, home to Art Bell, who is genuinely one of my favourite radio hosts ever, and another man that does deal in conspiracy. Although admittedly, Art Bell's focus was always more on like strange phenomena than politics. Richard ended up taking his own life outside of a Masonic temple called the House of the Temple in Washington, DC on October 14th, 2018. He actually died around 30 hours later, and the story is so incredibly depressing. His final moments are truly horrifying. And I'd really recommend that people go and pick up T's book, American Madness. It really is the best book that I've read on conspiracy theories, specifically around Bohemian Grove and how harmful they are. Like, these conspiracies ruined Richard's life. They really did. Like, when you read the book, it paints this picture of a man who could have done something. He was very creative. He had all of these comic books. He had all of these ideas, but his mind had been so warped by people like Alex Jones. Despite not agreeing with anything that he stood for, I really do have sympathy for Richard. We look at cults and extremism online and how easily people can be radicalized for misinformation, and the same does go for conspiracy theories like the ones that surround Bohemian Grove. Not only do they make it incredibly difficult to have a rational discussion about the ethicalness of something like the Grove, but they also warp the mind of people that get sucked into believing snake oil salesmen like Alex Jones.
Mr. Jones, are you finally prepared to admit that you have indeed caused these families a substantial amount of pain? Are you prepared to admit that?
I am not prepared to sign on to whatever you and the mainstream media make up about me.
You get Richard McCaslin breaking in, expecting to find George Bush in the middle of a sacrifice, only to discover that the sinister Moloch owl is really hollow and most of the time is just used as a storage device. I've got another video on satanic panic where I talk about how it really hasn't gone anywhere. It's just evolved over time and led to the pizza thing and the 17th letter of the alphabet thing, both of which have inspired violence. I think Bohemian Grove is worthy of scrutiny and protest. I think that powerful men meeting in secret to discuss business and politics goes against everything that a so-called democracy should stand for.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club.
By operating in secrecy, Bohemian Grove opens itself up to speculation and conspiracy, but the focus is so skewed. And I think that's the thing that irks me the most, that by painting the Bohemian Grove as something deeply satanic and ritualistic, the work of people like Mary Moore and the Bohemian Grove Action Network gets totally forgotten. Serious conversation about how Bohemian Grove is essentially a playground for rich men to talk shop and behave like animals gets replaced by loudmouth Texans screaming about Moloch.
Look at it right there.
That is...
You've got Death on this black boat bringing a pallet with like a paper mache person, obviously. You know, it's got the feet and the body and the head here under the deal, and then they take it over and they burn it.
Under a black...
For some idol, for some owl god that it really looks like a demon. It's got like horns up there.
It does no good for anyone, except maybe the Bohemian Club, who can brush off all those who question their secrecy as crazy conspiracy theorists.
Because some of us are willing to spill our blood with a sacrifice. You hear me, scum? We're coming for you.
I hope you enjoyed this video. I know that it might be controversial for some who might have clicked on it looking for someone to reinforce Alex Jones's talking points, but I hope that maybe it might have offered you a different look into Bohemian Grove. Either way, let me know what you think in the comments and I will see you in the next video. Bye!
In closing, I'd like to thank my supporters, whoever they may be. Semper Fidelis, to the American people.